Hello, everyone. Welcome to One Shot NPCs, hosted by Wandering DMs. We are here. Excellent. It looks like everything's working and we're live. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. We have a nice panel today about one-shot NPCs, specifically how to build interesting NPCs for players to interact with when you're on a time budget. Maybe you're running a convention game, maybe you're just running a one-shot for one night. How do you get interesting NPCs and interesting plot based around those NPCs in such a short time frame? Before we get into it, let's do some introductions. So I am Paul Siegel. I am co-host of Wandering DMs. That's the channel you're watching right now. Thank you for joining us. You can find us on wanderingdms.com. I also write a blog called Paul's Game Blog. You can find that at paulsgameblog.com, where I do post about my DMs Guild and DriveThruRPG publications, which I'm sure I will reference tonight. Let's go around. Elise, can you tell us your name and your pronouns and where your work can be found online, please?
Oh, sure. So
sorry,
my pronouns are... Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I totally forgot my own pronouns. I'm he, him. Thank you. Go on, Elise.
All right. So my pronouns are she, her. My name is Elise Kertel. I am at DNDElise on Twitter and Facebook. I am a published writer for D&D 5e content on the DMs Guild and DriveThruRPG. And I have a big Through the Veil Tales of the Feywild project coming soon, which will be a volume, a fee collection in the Feywild.
Awesome, thanks, Elise. Domille, by audio only, please. Please introduce yourself. Tell us your name, pronouns, where we can find your work.
Hi. My name is Domille, or Dom for short. And I'm a cartographer. You can find me on Patreon, patreon.com/DWW. I have my maps on DriveThruRPG as well. I have a few projects coming out on DMs Guild, the one that Elise just mentioned, as well as Talia's Tome of Tables is slated to come out later this year in DMs Guild. It's a big tome of tables. Yeah, that's me. Hi, and I'm she, her.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Domille. Drew.
Hi, everybody. I'm Drew Dawes, he, him. I'm on Twitter at DrewDwarves. And today, I just realized, is my 1-year anniversary of writing on DMs Guild.
Hey, happy anniversary.
Yeah, my first thing was published 1 year ago for the RPG Writers Workshop. And so I'm going to put it in chat. I made a bundle of half off all of my stuff from 2020. Everybody, here you go. You can check it out.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Nice anniversary gift for all of our viewers. Finally, Micah.
Hi, I'm Micah Watt. I run Pyromaniac Press. I can be found at Pyromaniac Press on Twitter and Facebook, and pyromaniacpress.com. I publish on the DMs Guild and DriveThruRPG, much like everybody else on this chat. I'm not as prepared as Drew. I don't have any links or anything like that, so you'll have to, if you're interested in my stuff, you'll have to look at it the hard way by finding us on DMs Guild. And he, him.
Excellent. So we're going to have about an hour of discussion here and then a half hour of Q&A at the end. If you do have a question, feel free to put it into the chat at any point. I just ask that you prefix your chat with the word question. So just put question and then your question after that. And we will get to that in the bottom half hour. So let's get this kicked off. Anybody, I have a kind of a loaded question here of like, who's got like a favorite NPC? Does anybody think of an NPC they either wrote or they played with that in this kind of situation where you are in a one-shot game and it really sang?
Yeah. So I've written games where I've like just a random NPC I put in there last minute, and like everyone was very attached to this NPC and ended up showing up in every single game. And I think because she was like I work skilled, she was a good romancer, which was something in the realm of D&D. So maybe it's her uniqueness in carrying around a burlap sack of bones was why they found her very entertaining to have around. But I ended up publishing her NPC collection later on, just to commemorate that table and that NPC that I didn't expect to last more than one game. So.
Yeah, isn't that always the case, right? That it's the odd NPC that you didn't expect the players to latch onto that they suddenly love and becomes a recurring character for
Always.
session after session.
Almost always.
Great. Anybody else got an example of one? Yeah.
I tend to run a variation on a theme. If I need a bit of a throwaway NPC or again, someone to introduce people to, the hook or what have you, I tend to go with the sort of the naive, young, bumbling sort of scholarly priest. So, of any given sort of deity that's in the local area, the kind of, the kid that and gender is non-specific, doesn't matter, but the sort of the kind of the wide-eyed naive joined the clergy to follow their dreams, but ends up basically in this sort of nothing posting in the middle of nowhere, just trying to be their best self. And I tend to think that the kind of the helpless, sort of hopeless, naive characters NPCs tend to draw people in quite quickly. The sort of the heroic nature of characters and the social contract that you're there to do a job, or you're there to save the town, or you're there to help out, or what have you. There's the players tend to attach to that sort of well-meaning but pretty useless NPC fairly quickly, and kind of want to help them or take them under the wing or take the pressure off them. The hook is that this naive priest has been given this job that they're completely unsuited for. Save this sort of young idealist before they are crushed by the weight of the world, kind of thing. So that shows up in most of my games at some point. If I just need to kind of hook them into something, the players into something reasonably quickly without a great deal of background or anything like that. So given more time, obviously you create more enticing NPCs, but that's a nice, quick, easy one.
Great.
I noticed that I think that my players tend to latch on to very big personalities with NPCs, and so if I know I want them to pay attention to a certain NPC, I will make them just grand. I'll make them the grandest personality they will ever meet, and that will ensure that they will remember this one. And really quirky, like weird quirks.
Yeah, for sure. I think I saw something just go by in the chat about naming an NPC Mr. Pickles will inevitably cause the players to adopt that NPC.
I love that name.
Yeah.
I gotta write that down.
That's great.
That's the name
How
of
about
my
you, Drew?
next
Oh,
Yeah, and then thanks
Sorry,
Mr. Pickles.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Mr.
Drew, I didn't mean to talk over you.
That's all right.
We have
Clearly
been
got our
emailed by Mr.
coordination
Pickles.
down. Apologise to everyone. Before Drew goes, I just wanted to say, anyone who actually puts something in the chat, just understand that you're talking to 4 or 5 DMs Guild writers here. Anything you say can and will be stolen by us. I'm kidding, of course, but certainly great ideas that come through these chats we do tend to latch on to. So just be aware of that. If you followed Elise from here on in, you'll see Mr. Pickles show up in one of her adventures. I can almost guarantee it. Sorry, Drew. Sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, Mr. Pickles even sounds like a cat, and that's my favorite is the talking animal. You're always going to get someone who really wants to know, why are you talking? Are you an animal that talks? Are you a person that turned into an animal? Where's your druid friend? Someone's going to latch on somewhere, especially if it's like a domestic, a cat or a dog that people can relate to. And then you can really give it your own personality. that you want. Maybe it's based on your own pet that you know, and so it's really easy to write for them or to DM and act it out because you already have their personality in your head, and now you get to vocalize it. So that's really fun to do.
Yeah, and I thought of one more. I noticed like NPCs that have stuff are helpful. Like, do they have a wagon? Oh, I have a ballista out back. You know, I feel like players love stuff. And I think that's helpful to have a quest giver that's like, oh, by the way, I have this wagon. You know, because then they do fun things with the wagon and sometimes things you don't expect. So I think that's another way to get players interested in NPC.
Yeah, that's
I love the idea of an NPC having a ballista. It's like, oh yeah, I just got a ballista out back. I'm now going to have a recurring NPC that just carts around a ballista. No reason. They acquired it once and now it's with them forever.
Just a casual ballista. No big deal.
When I drive through town.
I mean, it's an interesting point, right? That oftentimes we're putting these NPCs in because they're there to give the players information, right? That's one of their primary goals is to help the players learn something about the setting or the plot or whatnot and move things along. So yeah, you totally want, right? You want those characters to be approachable and interesting, and you give your players excuses to talk to them, right?
Right. Yeah. Especially if they are, the way that the exposition's going to get into their hands.
Yeah.
Otherwise they might as well just be a scroll, refer back to it.
Right,
so.
right. I mean, and that's classic too, right? Leave letters and notes and etc.
I think you have to hit the right notes with an NPC. Sorry, no, go on.
No, I was going to push us along. You have a thought, Micah?
Well, just in terms of I think we've kind of hit sort of a few sort of similar elements. I mean, the appeal element, that it's cute or it's quirky or it's an animal or it's helpless, and that appeals to a sort of a human nature. But I think also you need to make sure that the bait is right for the audience or what you're trying to do. I mean, cute animals are fine, but they may not fit in every setting. If you're running a sort of a dark, sort of grimdark kind of street sort of thief type adventure, then your cartoonish sort of chattering cat is probably not necessarily the best. I mean, you can certainly work that, but you definitely have to have the right flavor for what you're trying to present to make sure that it's not just that the messenger is interesting, but that they're contextually correct for what you're trying to present. Otherwise, you're going to get this sort of weird tension in the players where they're trying to make sense of things that don't suspend their disbelief. I use that term fairly loosely. I think the other thing though is I think sometimes you can overload an NPC in terms of their bait. I have to admit, when we first started talking about doing this panel, I think probably everyone's seen this, but I kept coming back to that meme that was kicking around the Twitterverse for a little while about Sam Smorkle, the goblin, and if people don't know this, I think it started as a tall tale somewhere and then got sort of retweeted and so forth. This idea that the DM sets up this bar and the players enter the bar and he describes the NPC of note, and the NPC of note is an ex-adventurer, and they've got like a crown of thorns and glowing fire around their hand, and obviously magical sword, and they're sitting at the bar, and they've invested in this NPC, and they've given them all these really sort of badass hooks, and of course the players will love that, and then the next line is the players say, oh, who else is at the bar? And the DM is trying to downplay everyone else. Oh, it's a couple of locals and, one goblin sitting at the bar, right? And players, oh, what's the goblin's name? DM begins to panic. Sam Smorkle, right? And then suddenly Sam Smorkle becomes the thing, right?
Yep.
Sam Smorkle, the goblin, is the NPC they latch onto. And, I think, again, as much as we're talking about NPCs for one-shots, that you want to make them interesting at a glance, I think sometimes you can, as a writer or a DM, invest too much in an NPC without really taking into account the nature of the audience, whether it's your players or someone who's going to be looking at your adventure. And I think sometimes you maybe get carried away in your own narrative, and it's like, oh well, this badass ex-adventurer who's clearly got stories to tell, and no, they want to talk to the goblin. And I think sometimes you have to be a little bit flexible on that and realize that if you put all your eggs in one basket, sometimes that NPC isn't necessarily going to work out. Sometimes it's better to have maybe a backup NPC, or be aware that what you think is cool, or what you think is a great hook, or what you think is great bait is not necessarily going to be that for everybody. And sometimes, sometimes, almost always, the players will latch onto the innocuous NPC that was always meant to be a throwaway, a bit piece, or whatnot. And I think sometimes you have to harness that, be prepared for that, and have a backup plan. And be prepared to move your NPCs. The cool ex-adventurer, well, maybe they're not as important now as Sam, and some of those traits you were going to give to that adventurer now have to be transferred to that new NPC.
Yeah, in terms of writing, right, you can try to split that up a little bit, right? You can try to maybe point out, here are the NPCs, but here are the important, like, their reasons for being in this scene, right? Here's the information they're trying to give, or here's the way that they will push the plot forward, so that it basically sort of trying to arm the DM with, if the players latch on to the goblin on the end, maybe you can lift this important piece and just reassign it to this other NPC. I always think of sort of this metaphor of like, when you're writing content for DMs, that it's like you're a director at a shoot for a movie, but the actual DM is going to be the editor, and that's the person who's going to put together the final story. So you want to arm them with as many pieces as possible so that they can assemble something good at the table.
Yeah, that's great.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
So what else can we do?
Also,
what else can we include in our writing to make these interesting NPCs? Anyone have any ideas?
I think that
there's. Go ahead.
Let's see. Less is more a lot of times, especially if it is a one shot. You don't need a half the page to be about one character, especially if they're not the focus of the adventure. It's a lot of times just maybe one or two sentences, and maybe just a little bit. This is one thing they like. This is how their voice sounds. This is what they're here to do, and the end. And then just a couple little interesting tidbits here and there, and then just trust that the DM is going to come up with something cool for their table.
Yeah, and to respond to what Drew's talking to, I think this varies between one-shots compared to like a campaign. I learned a valuable lesson here of like, when is it to put more and when is it to do less? Because if you have, like, say, Curse of Strahd, and you have this huge campaign, a huge block plays a huge role in that campaign, while characters, the children of the house, they just get the little pairs that make sense for that one-shot adventure. And I think it goes really has to see like super important. Sometimes you don't even put it up here because maybe people expect a lot more from that NPC if there's description about them in that front matter, but they're not in the story. And when cases like that come up, you just be like, oh, you're in a goblin cave, and look, there's Sam, and you just write it in that area, and you don't necessarily give Sam a block if he doesn't play a huge role in that NPC shot. But I think one-shots are super challenging because you have a really small window to get someone interested in a character. Mm-hmm. You have to use that short window of space to create something, some sort of emotional interest in the players, so that they even gravitate toward that person who might be your quest giver or might have important information. So I think there's definitely a challenge with that, because with like other media, like books and movies, you have all this time to build up your characters and stuff. Or if you have a huge campaign like Curse of Strahd, you have time to build up who Strahd is and what games he plays with people, etc. But you don't necessarily have that when you're in a one-shot. So I think there's definitely a challenge for writers to create like exciting in a small window of a one-shot.
Yeah, I mean, I would wonder about like, well, what is the setting for this one shot, right? Is this just a content that you're writing just for like an off night or something that someone's going to roll into their campaign, or are we talking about a convention game where you're going to sit down with a bunch of strangers, play this game, and then walk away and no one ever sees each other or the characters again? In that latter case, I think there's really some interesting things you can do. In those kinds of games, I'm used to typically writing pre-generated characters for the players to play. And then if you're going to do that, maybe you can bake some of this into the characters rather than the NPCs, right?
Yeah.
I think the best NPCs for one-shots serve potentially all of those purposes. As you're saying, if it's literally a one-shot with people you never see again, you still want it to be interesting enough that they have a little bit of investment in it. But also, I think if you create an NPC well enough, you'll for perhaps a one-shot for your regular group, or things that you hope will transfer into a larger campaign. I think if you write the NPC well enough with enough enough breadcrumbs, if you like, for them to then put their own stamp on it and carry it on if that's essentially going to be how they're utilizing that adventure. I tend to look at, specifically for one shots, I tend to look at NPCs basically having essentially two elements: the bait and the hook. Right, so the bait's basically, at a first glance, what attracts the players to this NPC, and the hook is, well, now they've been attracted, how are you going to keep their interest or get their investment? And this is all very similar to what Drew and Elise were saying about that first sort of glance at, okay, well, what do they look like, or what do they sound like, or how do they present? Because that's the first introduction, and then a few little bits and pieces, tidbits, something quirky about them, or something that after they've had their little spiel about, giving the quest or being that next chain of contact in a quest or something like that, that gives them the appeal for people to look back and go, that was interesting. A little personality quirk or something about the way they dress or their mannerisms, or even their voice, and not all DMs do voices, and not all DMs do voices well, if they do voices, as most of the chat has probably picked up on now. My accent is very Australian, and almost all of my NPCs start with a certain voice and end up basically being Australian. I like dwarves. I play dwarves, I run dwarves, and there's pretty much a standing joke at my table that dwarves are Australian, because all of my dwarf NPCs end up having more dialogue than most others. And so what happens is, for all of the other NPCs, I can generally keep the voice or the tone just long enough. For all the dwarf NPCs that are recurring or end up staying with the party or have a bigger role, I always end up losing the voice, and it goes into my own voice. So I think when you create those mannerisms, I mean that alone can make an NPC interesting, just the quirks of the DM as well. But I think you need to add a few little breadcrumbs that want or give the players the opportunity to dig a little deeper if they want, but not make it so plot centric that if they don't dig deeper, it's not going to derail the entire plot. If the NPC has a deep dark secret that they I don't know, they're afraid of ice cubes or something, and the dungeon later on is an ice dungeon or whatever. I'm not at my best at the moment. That's not a very good hook. That's terrible, in fact. But my point is, don't make those plot centric. Don't make them make or break for the adventure. But give them enough that if they want to dig or they want to develop their relationship, that there might be something there, something useful. And if they engage in those quirks, maybe offer them a little bonus, for taking the time, for taking the extra 5 minutes in maybe a very time-limited con, a little bit of extra information, or, perhaps that NPC takes a shine to the character because the character took the time to indulge in their quirk, and rewards them for that. Maybe your NPC is a gnome that loves pocket watches. The players ask about their collection or their, what's the oldest one or the most, strange one that they got. And for that,
that's me.
5-minute conversation, the gnome, offers them a pocket watch, actually gives them one of their collection, or maybe something useful like a potion of healing or something like that. Oh, Drew's already onto it, right?
Got it.
I'm a
He's got
gnome that
props.
loves pocket watches, sir.
That's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think
Nice.
Favorite
I
one.
think
You can win this.
you've got a great point there, Mike, about including quirks.
Oh.
I think there's also like, with a short form game that's only meant for 4 hours or so, it can be very easy to accidentally make your NPCs too one-dimensional, right? And then they're boring, and then the players don't want to interact with them. I like to try and bake in at least one maybe contradiction into the character, just because people are contradictory, and so put something in there that gives them a little bit more dimension. I'm struggling now to come up with an example. Something like, right, somebody, if you have that wide-eyed, over-eager, who's bitten off more than he can chew kind of character, as you mentioned earlier, who's trying to, get the players to come and do a thing. Maybe he's also very proud about that and will maybe not be, kind of try to resist at first the players taking over his job or something like that.
I also wanted to touch a little bit on the whole accent that Micah mentioned. So I have a Russian accent, and I can't get rid of it no matter what I do. I can try and fake like New York City accent and a couple of others, but generally I'm pretty bad at doing accents, but I voice all of my NPCs always. And I think that the trick to it is not necessarily being good at accents, it's about intonation, it's about mannerisms, it's about how they speak, how these NPCs feel and whatnot. So you really don't have to be good at accents to be decent or even interesting to voice different types of NPCs.
Sure, and what about I would not undermine or overlook the visual aspects too. Like, what kind of details can we add in just the physical description, or how they smell, or what kind of sounds are coming, right? Try to add the other senses in there too when first introducing the character to give the players something to latch onto.
Yeah.
That's
to talk
really
about what
good one
Paul
you
said.
had there, Paul.
Sorry, go Elise.
That's right. I think we're going to make the same point. We're just talking over each other.
Oh, sorry. But real quick, I think it is important to mention all the different senses, because there are people different kinds of disability statuses, so maybe they're blind, or maybe they have something else going on where maybe one of those senses, describing just one sense wouldn't work for that player. So I think to have like a really good solid NPC, it is important to mention like all those different senses, not only as a DM but as a writer as well. So you can, especially new DMs, with exploring that aspect of games.
Yeah, it can add a nice.
Also, we take that for granted. Sorry, Paul.
Go ahead, Micah.
I appear to have my timing really off today. I do apologise if I talk over anyone. It's a great point. It is we take for granted that sense of sight. The first thing you do with an NPC or anything is you describe what it looks like. But I think for a secondary and a deeper level of immersion, even those of us that primarily sight still have other senses, and a particular sound or a particular smell, or even just a texture, because you can describe texture as sight, but we process texture as touch. So if you say something's rough, immediately you already know how rough feels in your head. It's not just something that you see. You can see something's rough or smooth, but if you say it's rough, people automatically encode that as the feel of rough or the feel of smooth. Or you say silk, and it's the softness, the slipperiness, the feel of silk, assuming someone has in fact touched silk. But I think that it's something as simple as engaging another sense or two other senses makes a world of difference to that depth, particularly if it's an NPC. If the pocket watch collecting gnome smells of tobacco, because he's a pipe smoker, that's 3 seconds of description gives you another another hook, something else to latch onto, that isn't just, well, he looks like this and he looks like this and they look like this and she looks like this. That gets a bit flat as well. So yeah, it's an absolutely brilliant point about adding the other senses, the depth it can create.
You can do some great foreshadowing with that too, where if you have a gnome who smells strongly of tobacco, maybe you introduce the notion of the character earlier on. The players hear about this gnome who's a tobacco aficionado and who's always buying fancy tobaccos. And then when you start in your description, you say you see this gnome approaching and you smell the strong waft of tobacco. Immediately they're going to be, oh, we know who this guy is. It's him. It's the gnome we've been looking for.
Not only that, you can take that foreshadowing further, and again, it will depend on the type of adventure. But let's say, the gnome is not all he appears to be. He might be the quest giver, but perhaps he has ulterior motives. Later on down the track, in the town, tracking down your MacGuffin, you enter a shop or a warehouse, and it smells strongly of tobacco.
Yeah.
And suddenly you've got this link back. Well, hang on a second, they say. You don't always have to drop the clues like a bowling ball to the face, I should say. Like sometimes, and again, I mean, sensory clues are a great way to add depth without going, well, here's the note that says, haha, I did it from the gnome. Sometimes you can use those little hooks in the NPC to actually hook into quite significant moments in an adventure.
Yeah. Yeah, that is good. And especially if it's something, that it's supposed to be a subtle detail, but it has big implications, you can just tell the players or just tell the DMs to just state it. You don't have to hide it behind a perception check or their passive perception, because then what if everyone rolls a 4, oh, you all smell something funny. Moving on, they're not going to get it. So, yeah.
What about visuals?
Yeah, I think that's also...
in terms of like actual visuals at the table, what about like a picture that you're going to show of the character? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I like
I'm
that.
Big fan of that.
There's a lot of
I think it comes down to if you have that opportunity and the time and the resources to prepare those. Prior to coming onto the stream, Paul and I were actually talking, and we're talking about the difference between online and in-person gaming. And I was saying that I used to prepare a lot of physical props. So if someone was getting a summons or a letter, I'd actually prepare a scroll and hand it to the players to then be able to open and have something tactile. NPC portraits are great. I mean, a picture paints 1,000 words, right? So in the space of taking the time to try and explain something, if you just hold up a picture or have it come up on the screen or have something to hand to the players, that can convey a lot as well. But I think that works only if you have, I guess, perhaps the right art or the right artist for the job. I mean, it's I
think though, let me jump in here, Micah. I think my point really is that there's a meta clue in there, right? There's the fact that I'm showing the players artwork is going to immediately clue them in of, oh, this person's important, right? You bothered to have artwork for them.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially online, they don't know that you just open a new tab and did a quick search and
did
just
a
found
quick
the first
image
thing on
search.
Pinterest. And yeah, I like to sometimes when I'm DMing, after do the written, if it's something else that either I made up or if I'm running something, after reading the description, I'll kind of describe them as an actor, because people can kind of then get a little bit of the tone and the voice, because I'm so bad at voices and accents. So, but if I say like he's a lot like he reminds me of Danny DeVito, then you got to okay, it's that voice, and he's very squat and kind of a rough attitude or whatever. But then people can kind of picture him. It's maybe it's tougher, as you can't just say that when you're writing it. But if you're DMing, that's a little shortcut to jumpstart something, especially if it's one of those, goblin in the second booth that they're like, who's that? And you had no idea. You can just, okay, it's someone.
I think something like a connection like that does help ground an NPC. I mean, I actually just wrote one for a project I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about, but I wrote an NPC, and this NPC needs to sort of describe certain things, and I actually wrote afterwards, basically as a note in my head, he sounds like Alan Rickman, that kind of, that dry, dismissive, sort of tone of I don't really, I'm telling you this, but I don't really care what you think. He's got that very sort of distant kind of way of talking, and I really when I was writing the NPC, I really that's what I was thinking of, as Drew said. I pictured everything this guy said in Alan Rickman's voice, and that kind of drove my ideas. And I thought, well, this is actually pretty useful information if you're going to be running this guy. I mean, you don't have to do it that way, but certainly, you can see where I was coming from when I put that together, and maybe that's enough of a quirk, or that's enough of a hook to get people to be invested, to connect with it. I mean, we're talking about making NPCs relatable. Certainly, pop culture references are very relatable. Personalities or things that appear in our current popular culture definitely hook people in quite quickly because it's already something we're experiencing.
Nice, yeah, I like that. I would try to put that in something I write. I like that.
Visuals can also be really good for those who are trying to practice art and whatnot. That's actually how I started. How I really got seriously into artistic endeavors with drawing and painting is drawing and painting for my games at first, and then became this, but that's a whole different situation. So it's a really good motivational type of thing where you can maybe try and draw it yourself too. But for home games, of course, I don't know. Well, I guess if you're DMing at cons, maybe if you're inclined to do so.
Yeah,
I think you underestimate the talent pool of the rest of us here, Dom. We're not all fantastically talented like you. I mean, my son, who's 5, draws better pictures than I do. I think if I wanted everyone to laugh at my NPCs, I could draw them. Just all these super serious NPCs just become these sort of comical kind of they've got eyes. You can tell they've got eyes, like little line mouth and squiggly body. Sort of amorphous, strange. I mean, that'd be memorable, I imagine. But
it's our old nemesis again, Jack O'Lantern.
That square is a gelatinous cube, folks. I thought it agreed.
All right, let me ask a fair, possibly controversial question here. Box text. What do you guys think? Yay or nay?
It depends. When I was a DM, I homebrewed a lot, so while I read adventures, I was looking for ideas for traps or encounters, and just skip over the box text stuff. But now as a writer, I really enjoy writing them. It's a place where you can set the mood, you can set the scene, you can really tap into that senses category, like, do you feel humidity? Do you smell lilacs? I think it's a great place to put that stuff, because even if the DM isn't, I never sit there and read stuff aloud, but I use flavor text and that stuff to kind of set the mood and set the scene, and I'll do my own, while preparing, I'll do an impromptu summary, I guess, of what that is, because I think it does help immerse the reader into the adventure you're creating, because a lot of the other text is just like, oh, there's a chair here, oh, there's a box there, watch out for that monster, and that flavor text kind of hits those other notes, I think. So.
I think it's a useful tool if used sparingly, and I think it's important that you use it in the right way. As Elise said, it's to give you a quick summary of what's there, and if good box text shouldn't be more than a few lines long. Whether it's a location, whether it's an NPC, whatever, it should be just enough to paint a picture and no more, because you don't want to be. And there are some cardinal rules with box text. Never tell people what they do, in box text. Never tell people how they feel in box text. Never assume actions on the part of the players in box text. So never say, you see this gnome. He makes you. He reminds you of this, or he makes you feel this. When you talk to him, he says this. Right? Never make those assumptions. You don't want your box text to be a story. It's not something to take agency away from the players or the DM. It's just a little tool there to go, well, here's what you see, and then everything else about that scene, reactions, expected outcomes, what if they do this, then this happens, or if they step on this square, then things blow up. That's all in the general text. So that's certainly not something you'd read out. And again, I mean, for things like NPCs, I'm very hesitant to use box text to monologue, because again, you're basically you're making an assumption. Oh, the players will sit here and listen to the villain's monologue, or they'll listen to the gnome's life story about his 15 pocket watches. He opens his coat. There's nothing but pocket watches. I think my overarching rule, of course, is that if you don't have box text, it can't be used. If you do have box text, it can be ignored. So my feeling when I'm putting together a product is I'll always offer the DM something. I think you need to assume your DM's quite capable, can make their own decisions, can put their own spin on things, but you don't want to give them nothing. There's actually a really big conversation going around on Twitter a while back, and I think one of the DMs Guild writers was holding up one of the old Against the Giants modules as the epitome of this great idea of condensed writing, and it was something like 40 or 50 rooms in like 11 pages. And so it was like, everything had, some rooms literally had like 3 lines of text. And I looked at that and I thought, well, yeah, but most of those rooms are empty and they're boring and they've got nothing in them. Like Elise said, there's a chair over there, there's 15 boxes and one of them has swords. Like, well, I mean, I as a writer, I want to offer the DM a little bit more, a little bit more options here. And again, they can do whatever they want with that room. They can scrap whatever I've got in there and put whatever they want. They don't like how I've written my NPC. Great. Change it. Whatever works for you. But if you don't offer them that something in the beginning, I think you're doing them a bit of a disservice. You're basically saying, well, look, I'm providing something for you, but you do all the work. And I just don't think that's good design, to be honest. That was my rambling speech on box text.
When creating these, it's really important to tell writers tell DMs when to read them too. So sometimes it's just like, in your front matter, like, as soon as they enter the room, you can read the box text if you want to. But sometimes there's situations where it's like, okay, if they climb into this thing, like this flavor text is super important. So I think that's like a little place where you can kind of deviate from always sticking it at the top. Also, don't repeat what you're doing in the box text down in the text below. So make sure every section of your adventure has new information. You're not wasting space by being redundant, because usually folks do have a word count when creating these, so keep that in mind too.
I feel like when you're talking about NPCs specifically, and like you said, like the last thing I want to see is a giant box of paragraphs of monologue that I have to say, wait, players, don't act. I have to read all this stuff. I think much more interesting is if you can include just a couple quick bullets or notes about what are this NPC's main motivations, right? What do they want, right? Like, this is a gnome who loves pocket watches and will do anything to get them, right? Great, now you've armed the DM with the motivation of the NPC, and they can ad-lib whatever they need.
Oh yeah, I noticed Dungeons and Dragons start doing like, here's their flaw, here's their, here's this, and there's one of those for all the NPCs. So that is a good approach to handling small spaces and big details about your NPCs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen some that are starting to, maybe it's the Adventures League ones where it's actually part of the appendix. It's just a little, the summary. That way you can just kind of pick and choose. Maybe there's 5 NPCs in one thing, but you really like this one or these 2, and so you can just go to town and really DM with those, and then the other ones you just kind of skip. Especially if you only have 3 hours and you've never run it before, and you're just kind of running it for the first time. You're at a convention. You do kind of need to keep the pace going. So just anything where you'll find one thing that you'll latch onto. If you're DMing, the more into it you are, I think that is contagious for the players.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting when you get into that, again, we're talking about this very short form of play. I almost think that there's sort of 2 different ways we can expect the reader to read the text, right? There's the initial read that when they're doing in preparation, where you want more text because I need to know everything that was in your brain when you wrote this. I need it so I understand how to run the game. But then also when I'm at the table and I need a reference, now I want very little text. I want just quick notes so that I can remind myself, oh, this, bing, 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 run the game. I've never written an adventure. Now I kind of want to write an adventure that way. Here's the prepare section and here's the running section.
Yeah.
That's actually that was a bit of a feature of 4th edition. It's they had the layout where it was here's all about it, and then here's the battle map with the icons and where all things go and what you do. Really sort of quick summary of the I guess encounter, if you like, whether it be a combat encounter or not. It was pretty good at kind of laying those things out. I think that's probably an idea that I think has been moved away from again. We're sort of back into kind of embedded or inline areas, much like the earlier editions. But it's certainly, information at a glance is really important, especially for con games. I've run plenty of con games where, you read it beforehand, but you just, you've got so many pages and very little time, and you just need to get through these things, going to the back and trying to sift through, half a page of NPC information when you just need the bullet points. What are they doing here? What's their purpose? What are they like? What do they dislike? How do they, what secrets are they hiding? I actually noticed a comment in chat which was really good, and that's basically, note down, what they're concealing, or what they're willing to say and what they're not willing to say, and that then also allows you as DM to go, right, well, here's what they'll give up freely. Here's what the players are going to have to dig for, and then you can set in your mind, well, how? Can you intimidate them? Can you persuade them? What are the DCs for those things? At a quick glance, well, here's the stuff that's easy, here's the stuff that's hard. So I like that.
Let me pose you guys a question before we run into the Q&A time. So when we're talking about short form convention game, you've got 3-4 hours to run this game, and you've got rich characters, rich NPCs who have interesting backgrounds, and probably you've got some interesting plot, maybe with some twists and whatnot going on. How do we arm the DM to be able to get to the climax and resolution of the game in just 3 or 4 hours? Or what can we put into the writing to help them fit the adventure to the time?
That's a really tough one, and I'll give you an example of why. Last year, I was running a same adventure repeatedly in a con. It was the Heir of Orcus by I've forgotten his name, and now I'm going to pay. I will find it, make sure it ends up in the chat or something like that. But Heir of Orcus, it's a really good series.
Anthony.
Anthony Joyce. Yeah, of course. I was trying to think of his Twitter handle, and I live in Twitter a lot of the time, and of course, people's Twitter handles are often very different from their names. So it's Thrawn something is his Twitter handle, and anyway, that's besides the point. So, most of them ran as they should in the approximate time frame of about 2 hours. They got through the initial sort of hook encounter, then followed it on to the main encounter area where they had to do some investigation, discover the twist or the plot or the betrayal, and determine how they were going to then proceed from then on. It's actually a really well set out series of modules. That being said, I had one group, and I tell this story semi-regularly. I had one group where the initial encounter, and I do apologize for spoilers, anyone who's going to run this or wants to run this, the initial encounter is actually with basically the players are sent out, and the adventure starts, you're sent to a place. The initial encounter is actually with a knight who is trying to dissuade you from going to this place and talking to these people because these people are evil, right? Now, whether or not they are is for you to determine. But essentially what happened in one of these games was the players got so caught up in this negotiation with this knight and his retinue, they got so invested in it as players, and again, they really invested in this NPC. And I don't know if it did anything different with him on this particular game, but something clicked, and they wanted to dig deeper. Why is he like this? You know, what's his motivation? Is this real or is he lying? You know, does he have a hidden agenda? You know, and to be honest, I was playing this guy basically as a fairly vapid sort of meathead character, and I think they were trying to, if that was an act by the NPC or he was actually that dumb. And so this whole conversation, convoluted back and forth ensued, and they finally decided, they talked this guy they basically backed him into a corner where he basically said, at this point, you know, if you go to this place fighting with evil and I'm going to have to destroy you, right? And that's not how the module's supposed to go, but they'd essentially backed this guy into the corner in this role-playing encounter. And so then combat started, and what's supposed to be basically, you know, a few minutes, he's supposed to be tough, right? But a few minutes, they'll run away or they'll run him off or whatever. Just became a wild, ongoing thing. We had guys sneaking off into the underbrush and trying to get their, you know, run their carriage away, which then, of course, you know, got out of control, and so they had this carriage chase going on. It overturns at some point. There's a brush fire started. The bard's trying to seduce half the retinue. They end up challenging this guy to one-on-one combat, and someone summoned a giant stag in the end of it that actually rammed him and killed him. And this combat and this encounter took almost the entire time. And no matter how I tried to get the adventure back on track, I'm like trying to give short answers and you know, like just trying to get out of this encounter. They were determined to just have the best experience, and quite frankly, it was the most entertaining game I've ever run at a convention. The players all left. You know, like, got several high fives and a couple of handshakes, and everyone said, "Oh, this was fantastic!" And the whole thing was improvised. The whole thing was improvised because they just would not take the fairly subtle at the beginning and then fairly blunt clues at the end that they're wasting their time and just move on. They just didn't want to do that, and I think. At a convention, I think most convention players understand there's a time limit and that social contract. Yeah. They don't dig too deeply into the motivations. They're there, you know, as you say, often they've got, you know, pre-generated NPCs or they've brought their own, but they understand it's a pickup game. They're there to follow the adventure. Most players won't deviate. They'll just take at face value the hook. All right. Oh, this person needs me to get this. I'll just do that. All right. They don't tend to question the motivations of that. But every so often players want to do their own thing, and I think that's fantastic, but it's really hard as a DM to try and keep a set of players on track if they're really determined just to do their own thing. And I don't necessarily think you should. It was an AL game. They got no AL experience, so they didn't level up. They didn't treasure. I said to them at the end, guys, you've achieved none of the outcomes. I can't give you any credit for this module. I said, however, feel free to go and play it again and get your AL credit for it, because you've seen none of the characters. Nothing happened here. I'm glad you enjoyed your 2 hours. I'd love to see you guys again. All right. So it's difficult sometimes. Timed games can be quite difficult to keep moving, much like me talking.
Yeah.
I'll open it up to someone else now.
I agree with Micah that it's hard to write into your adventure. I think as a writer, the best thing you can do is playtest, and playtest a couple times, have other people playtest your stuff to kind of get an average of how long stuff is, but some of it, A, you can't always control the players, and B, it's almost like a DM skill, to kind of like, okay, we took a really long time here, so we're gonna like cut out this thing and go here or poof the monsters. So I don't know if that requires like to write a DMs Guild supplement on like DMs tips, but I think it's hard to be like, oh, you must do this for 5 minutes. You can't really control that in the game. It's pretty fluid.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that, but I think you could potentially, in your writing, if you're breaking it down into scenes or encounters or areas or whatever it is, whether it's location based or plot based, and there are specific points you expect the characters to move through. If you can indicate in your writing, like, these are the major beats, the important things that really need to happen for this story to make sense, whereas these are like inform your DM. This is the thing that could be cut, right? Like, here's a thing that can happen, but you could cut it if you need to for time. I think you can sort of help push the DM, or at least arm the DM with those decision points of where, what things are really important and what things can be trimmed. But it is hard.
Yes.
I mean, you'll never predict it 100%.
Especially if it's in the middle. If you front load important stuff in the beginning, and then you have your climax, and then here's a couple things, and depending on how long you have, you can stretch it. But if you don't have any time, you got the beginning and you got the ending, and that's what you need. Because if you spend too much time in the middle and then time's up and you moved on and you didn't get your climax, that can be pretty disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree.
The other thing is,
so I was going to say I agree with Elise here that playtesting super important. Absolutely, you should playtest it, but you're definitely going to have at least one outlier, like it sounds like Micah had. Of there's going to be a group who's just
even if you playtest, don't get me wrong, the value of playtesting cannot be overstated. You've got to playtest because there will be big holes where you have your perspectives and the way you think things should go doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way they're going to go 99% of the time. The other thing is, I would say, is budget the time in the adventure, okay? And Adventures League does do this, and certainly if you're creating your own adventures, think about it along these lines of each scene or each segment should take a certain amount of time. And if everything falls in place, you'll have your 2 or 3 hour slot. And if it doesn't, at least you know how long is budgeted for that. So if you've got a 20-minute scene and it only takes 10 minutes, well, you understand you can pad later on. Or if you've got a 20-minute scene and it's taken 45 minutes, you've really got, it's not just, and I agree with Drew that you front load the important stuff and you have the climax and everything else in the middle can suffer, for lack of a better word. But I also think if you break that down into measurable things, measurable time slots, that might help people kind of manage their time a little bit better. But the other thing, of course, is no adventure survives contact with the players, and a combat you've budgeted 30 minutes for might take 2. The paladin crit smites on their first attack, bad guy is down, end of story.
Hashtag banish.
Or it might take. But yeah, and the role playing thing as well, and there's a bit of an infamous module out there in DMs Guild, in AL, which I won't spend too much time on, but it has these huge role playing sections. Role play this for half an hour. Move to this point. Role play this for half an hour. And I can tell you that that's not a good. It's very difficult to manage time on a role play. Almost impossible, because every group, especially at a con, is going to be different. Some players really want to get into it and develop the NPCs and talk about this stuff, and other players just want to swing their sword and get to the end. So there's a huge amount of variation in pickup games, particularly, and I hanging your hat on 30 minutes of role playing is almost always going to be a recipe for disaster in those environments. That sort of thing for a home group is perfect, because you know what your players are like and what they're capable of. But you certainly don't want to put that on a con DM, particularly if you're writing a module for other DMs to run.
All right. we're about at that time where I should start taking questions from the audience. So again, I will recommend or ask, please, to include the word question at the beginning of your question so that our moderators can find it and push it forward. I am going to push up the first one right now. So the question is it wise to create an NPC that you would play as a player, thinking it's got enough hooks? Likewise, sorry, I lost track. Likewise, creating a character that you know certain players would totally like to play, since you know their tastes.
Yeah, I think that can be wise. I know I've done a few NPCs in my adventures are actually my past characters, especially for my first one. That's kind of how it just spilled over. I had all these ideas and I started writing them down for like 3 years before I ever published anything. So then when it came time, I could draw on that, and I know them so well, and so it's very fun to do. It's very hard to edit the text box on those because I just want to write, I just want to write a book basically about them. But I think so. And then the second part of that, writing a character a player would want to play, I think, especially if it's for specific characters or specific players, their tastes, I think they would be very intrigued by them. They may want to try to align their characters with them and, become allies, or they may, become rivals.
I actually did something kind of the other way around, I guess, because I used some of the characters from past games, like actual PCs, and then used them as NPCs. So I don't know. I think it's a good idea.
Just with what you're saying, Dom, I think again, like, you can get real investment from that as long as the players are on board. And also speaking to what Drew was saying as well, I think these things can be great as long as a DM you follow the quintessential rules. And the quintessential rules are, it's the player's game. The second you write an NPC that you would want to play as a player and get so invested in it that it becomes the dreaded DNPC, the Dungeon Master's player character, where you're playing a critical role that the party relies on, I think that's a slippery slope, because at a certain point you may find yourself giving your character the pivotal moments, and I don't think that's the DM's role. That being said, if you have an X character as an NPC, your investment in that and your love of that character will often come through in your presentation, and that will help cement the player's interest in it, as long as it doesn't upstage them. Similarly, I've done what Dom's done. I've gone to players after a campaign's ended and said, right, we're starting a new campaign in this area. What I'd love to be able to do is cameo your old characters. Can I do that? And again, as long as they have input into that, I think that's great. That gives a great connection to the campaign. They're instantly going to like that NPC. All right, all the players will, because they know it's one of the characters, already know their motivations. It's a great tool when you don't want players to second guess motivations or try and decide if they're being, if they're going to be betrayed or backstabbed or whatever, because they already know the heart of that character. It's a bit meta, but certainly it can move things along. But I think it's absolutely critical that whatever you do with your NPCs, they're there to serve the player's interests and not your own.
Yeah,
and don't get me wrong, as a DM, you've got to get a lot out of it, but don't take center stage away from the players.
Right. I mean, that's the ultimate danger of the pet NPC, right? Is that you get too attached to it as DM, then possibly you are unprepared for, like, what if the players just decide that NPC's got to die, right? You have to be okay with that, right? You have to be able to let go, I think.
Don't you do it?
I've had that, actually. I've had players turn on an NPC that they're convinced is going to betray them, when there was no such part of the writing. But in the end, and again, like you've spent time at this NPC's been with them for a long time or whatever, you're invested in it, and maybe you've got something with that NPC to do in the future. But again, if the players turn and they go, right, we're just going to kill this guy, then as a DM, it's incumbent on you to facilitate that, whether or not you really agree with it. Now, there should be consequences, don't get me wrong, for, baldly sort of murdering an NPC. But at the same time, you shouldn't say, "Well, no, I like this NPC. What are you doing? You can't do that." You should facilitate the stupidity. I guess is what I'm saying. Players have the right to make bad decisions, and then as DM, you have the responsibility to craft
Make
the
them
outcomes for
happen.
that.
Yeah.
Well put, Micah. Well put.
All right, let me put up another question for us. Once played a convention game where the group achieved the stated goal, but failed the 3-part scenario because the DM forgot to share the significant info that the players hit the target of. As writers, is it appropriate to highlight this info as critical so that it is imparted if the target is hit by the players?
Oh, it's appropriate to do that. Yeah, it's a good idea to do that.
I think I think you kind of answer your own question in a lot of ways there. If that had been highlighted, then the DM wouldn't have missed that.
Right.
DMs aren't perfect, especially if they're running other people's adventures. Pretty much you've got a whole group of writers here, so we write adventures that we hope other people will play. When a DM picks up an adventure they haven't written themselves, sometimes they won't absorb all the information. They won't necessarily hit the salient points. They will forget things. Cons are very, everyone on this stream as both as us and as the people in the chat, I've obviously attended cons. I hope many of you have run games at cons because it's a fantastic experience. But often it's very pressurized. You don't have a lot of time. You might run multiple adventures. You absorbing that information, not getting it confused, trying to taking on the burden of trying to make sure everyone has a good time in a really narrow window, can often lead you to miss salient points. I mean, I've done it myself. I've got to the point of an adventure where there's something critical in there at X point that I just missed. And they end up doing this encounter, and they're kind of chasing their tails a little bit. And I'm like, well, how did this happen? And you sort of, you mentally tree back, and you realize, oh, I made that mistake. When writing, you definitely want to highlight those critical points for the DM. Bring them out in nice and bold. What are you meant to achieve in this scene? What's critical? What's just gravy? I think from a design point of view, it's a really good idea.
Yeah, I think too. If there is something don't put not critical stuff in your adventure, but 2, if it is super important, have it in the beginning, like in your introductory. Maybe have some clues, like some of the checks and stuff leading up to that important thing. So just it's like a movie. If something's important, show it, like the rule of 3, show it 3 times. Right. So that might help as a writer make sure the importance of that item gets moved to translated over to the DM. So.
Yeah, I was gonna totally agree with that, Elise. That's you just gotta, if it's that important, you should have multiple venues for delivering that piece of information, right? That's another trick I've actually used is if you have an NPC who's trying to deliver information or whose purpose in the adventure is to deliver information, give them a reason to want to share that information, right? Like if I have an NPC who knows the location of the dragon's lair, then maybe the players encounter that NPC because my town has been destroyed by a dragon. Please, I need help, right? So if the players are out seeking great sums of treasure and they're asking around, hey, who's seen a treasure? This NPC can come forward and say, there's a dragon. It's been destroying my village. Please help. Right, rather than have them be cagey and the players have to think to ask this NPC, do you know where the dragon's lair is?
You never want to put plot critical stuff behind gateways anyway, because otherwise, again, and this is probably showing my age, but a lot of the early D&D stuff, really early D&D stuff, you get half a dungeon, the other half is behind a secret door, and if you don't find the secret door, you don't find the rest of the dungeon, and it's a roll. It's a roll. There's a good chance at some point you will miss something critical if it's behind a gate. So everything that's important, the players should never have to work that hard for. It should never be behind a roll. It should, whether it's an NPC, if it's, like you've got to intimidate this information out of them, or you've got to persuade them. You should never put the plot critical information behind a roll, because rolls can be failed. Extra stuff, bonus stuff, useful things, more information to be more informed in the final encounter, that's great. Put that behind gates. But, because there should always be bonuses for success, but never put roadblocks in the way that's going to derail things or withhold critical information on the basis of a dice roll or the basis of a NPC's personality.
Yeah, I agree with that. You definitely have to have a clue that's out there. But I feel like after you have that clue that's already out there that doesn't require a roll, I do think having like other clues that they can find to like help build or support does help. So, and kind of like help emphasize something that is important. So.
All right, next question. Oh, not pressing the button right. Press the button. There we go. In short terms, what will you define as the purpose of the, all caps, in quotation marks, NPC in a one-shot? What shouldn't they be?
I think they shouldn't just be a signpost. They should really be there, because these are the DM's characters, that they get to control. So they should be there for the DM to tell the story through their voices.
Right. I feel like, Drew, you're getting back to like give them quirks, give them contradictions, give them something for the DM to roleplay, right?
Right.
I totally agree with that.
The other thing is, and I don't like forgetting on my soapbox, but I think the other thing the NPC should never be is detractive or closed or limiting. So, and again, as a middle-aged white guy, this is probably not my wheelhouse, but you should never create NPCs that limit, that discriminate, that assume, that make people feel less. They should always be, unless there's a very specific purpose, and that purpose is to essentially combat the NPC's ideas. NPCs are there to facilitate and make sure everyone has a good time, and I think it's important when you create NPCs, you do so in an inclusive way, and you're careful about how they're presented in ways that can potentially harm people that you didn't necessarily think of. So they do, when you're creating NPCs, they are meant to be just a facilitator, but also that sets the tone for the rest of the game as well, and I think it's important that's achieved in a way that it brings out people's enjoyment, not crushes it.
Yeah, I think PCs need to be diverse too. So don't have uniform NPCs. Don't be all men or all the certain race. Like, have diverse NPCs that are male, female, different sexual orientations, different disability statuses, different backgrounds. Because I think having a diverse set of NPCs as a writer or as a DM helps diverse people feel more comfortable at your gaming table. So I think diversity is super important when creating your NPCs.
Awesome.
But also, if you're going to do that, and you should do that, but don't make that characteristic their hook. Okay, and we'll go back to Skyrim. Skyrim's, I used to be an adventurer, but I took an arrow in the knee. All right, that is actually really poor NPC writing. There's nothing wrong with seeding that into your story, but it shouldn't be limiting. That guy used to be someone, but now because of this characteristic, he no longer is. That's a closed NPC. What you want is that NPC to have that characteristic and take it and shine with it. It shouldn't be their defining characteristic. It should be part of who they are and what contributes to their strength as a personality. That's a huge bugbear of mine. So sorry, soapbox. Apologies.
All right, I will move on to the next question then. All right, here's a question that's more of a plea for help. I have a problem. My players hate characters who deceive or work against them, even those intended to be morally gray. How do I soften that or give those characters some more likability?
I think it's a normal, like, as someone with a master's in psychology, I think it's a normal reaction to be upset when you get backstabbed by an NPC. So,
I think just figure out what kind of characteristics your players like in people, in just who are your players, and then play to that. Figure out what they want to see in a person, in an NPC, in a friend, and then do that. And then, just secretly backstab them. Don't give out too much,
Or are there other ways to create? Are there other ways to create like a gray area NPC where you're not backstabbing your players? Maybe they backstab someone in town, or figure out another way to do that without, if your player's like, man, I'm too impacted by repeated NPCs doing this. Also have a variety of NPCs, like have good ones that are actually good, and some that are, there's a spectrum, just like with people. So.
Yeah, or if you want to play in the moral gray area, why not maybe actually have that character be conflicted about what they're doing, and maybe have them flip, right? Maybe they start out deceiving the player characters and then flip and say, I have to come clean. Now I'm going to help you.
Yeah, or make it a feature of the character where, and this is sort of part of what both Paul and Elise are saying, is those betrayals. If you want to have characters that are naturally deceitful, those betrayals don't necessarily have to be cataclysmic betrayals. I mean, it sounds like your players, and again, I don't want to assume anything about your game, but probably it's the one spit and dry sort of metaphor where perhaps they either in your game or someone else's game they have had this betrayal that has really impacted on the way they now see NPCs. You can alter that by the types of betrayal. Have an NPC who's generally neutral to the party, but this rakish, roguish sort of charming character who isn't on the level, all right, or who talks about certain scams or cons or whatever, but they're never super harmful. People don't die, people don't livelihood, they don't ruin people. It's small stuff. I say Robin Hood stuff, but I play maybe it's a practical joker character who plays jokes on his his noble friends. And I say noble because generally you want to punch up, not punch down, right? So people who can take it. So maybe he's a rogue that regularly sort of steals his friends' possessions and then puts them in embarrassing locations. Self portrait of this noble ends up on the the town square statue or something like that. That sort of thing. So you can see it in like call them little betrayals. These grey betrayals where they're not really you're not playing for sheep stations. The world isn't turning on one betrayal, destroying all the players' good work or completely obliterating their trust. And you can kind of begin to work that element back into your game where it almost sort of, I don't want to say normalizes deceit, but they realize that there's not, it's not black and white. There's not, everyone who ever betrays is catastrophically evil and irredeemable and must be destroyed. You can work those kind of more subtle influences into the game and hopefully get them used to that idea. I mean, I have to admit, as a DM, the betrayal is a magnificent storytelling device, especially if they're invested, especially if they thought that NPC was their friend or needed them, and they turn out to be a villain or the villain. I think you can get a great deal out of that as a writer, and I think players can get a great deal out of that if it's presented in the right way. But it sounds like those particular players are a little bit gun shy. They're the kinds of players that might end up knifing your perfectly helpful NPC just because they're paranoid and seeing betrayal behind every curtain.
And going back
I feel for your players.
Going back to what Paul said really quickly, with conflicting, there could be, good people that do bad things for a reason. Maybe they have done some really atrocious things, but they did it because they wanted to protect their family, or, they did it for a really, really good, compelling reason. So stuff like that, I think, can work too.
I think that could be a really powerful roleplay scene, honestly. Like if the players chase down an NPC who's done something terrible and they're ready to confront that NPC and ready to just jump on them and beat them into the ground, and the NPC turns and says, "I'm so sorry." Like, wow, like you've just twisted the whole adventure right on its ear. I think that's super fun.
I love surrendering NPCs, like surrendering villains. I think, especially when the players are gung ho for this creature's blood or this person's blood, anything that kind of subverts the normal tropes, like, oh well, this person must be evil because they've done X, Y, and Z, and then you fight through the minions, you get to the boss fight, and the boss fight goes, look, I give up. I'm sorry, or this isn't what you think, all right? And it turns out to actually be not what they think and not just a lie, right? I love those because it makes the players do a complete 180 on the situation and really re-examine how the story's been progressing. So I'm a big fan of surrendering villains. You can't do it too often. Because it loses all meaning, but certainly, the conflicted villain. I think also, again, you would play grey adventures, where morally grey adventures where there are no absolutes. These people should be given enough background in their. These NPCs should be given enough background that they have redeeming features, both positive and negative features. That it isn't just as simple as I twirl my moustache and do evil things. There's and that depth makes the immersion for the players much better as well.
Yeah, I think just to help the players, if it's something that is coming, and you want it to be like a gray area is the theme of the one shot or of your campaign, to just go over that in the session 0, or if it's a one shot, to start before you start getting into it, to set the tone. Otherwise, I know that happened to me. I was joining a new campaign and I trusted the NPC who turned out to be like the avatar of Tharzadoon, and we just everything was awful. But because we made one decision on our first game, it happened. And so I'm that player that like, no, they're evil.
That's great.
You touched on that, Drew. I love the idea of, if you are going to have betrayals, I love it. I love the idea of it swinging on a choice that the players make. Drew just said something they did in their first session caused this to happen. That's the best kind of writing, when you add to the storyline based on what the players do. And this goes back again to my talking about the players have the right to make stupid decisions, and your role as the GM is to give them the appropriate consequences. There's nothing better for both a DM and a player, in my opinion, as having a callback to something that they've done be a significant event or a significant turning point, or the direction of the campaign moves on a choice that they've made. And so in the end, they're kind of their own worst enemy, but they've helped write the story. And again, I think it's really important that as a DM, whether it's your own adventure, or whether it's a one-shot, whatever, that it's a collaborative process. You're not showing them a movie. You're offering them the opportunity to interact with the world to get a result. So the idea that Drew essentially created his own betrayal, I think is fantastic, and that's definitely a theme and an element that you should try to write into your adventures.
All right, we have time for maybe one or two more, depending, and I feel like I have to show this question because I think it's calling me out. Speaking sentient item NPCs, yay or nay? And I'm just going to jump on this right away, and I'm curious to hear what everyone else thinks, but I love them. Talk about a challenging acting role for the DM. This is an entity that sees the world completely differently from any other creature that you might get to roleplay. It has no ability to really act on its own accord. It must convince other people to help it. That is so interesting. I love it. What do you guys think?
I think
Yeah,
I agree with you, Paul, but
Yeah.
they're hard. I tried to do it in my campaigns, and they're not easy to RP properly.
Yeah, I could see they're hard. I mean, you gotta really come up with like what is the motivation and what is the technique for the sentient item. I have a stable of pre-gen characters I use for a lot of adventures that I run at conventions, and two of them, in fact, have intelligent weapons. And I play them radically different. One is truly resentful of its situation, and so it does what the owner asks, but is just full of insults and jibes, and just consistently resentful of its lot in life. And then I've got another one that's a sentient sword that's a coward, and would prefer that it not ever get used, and is constantly trying to be very helpful, but also maybe advise its owner to perhaps avoid the conflict and run away.
Yeah,
Those are my
that's a
Sentient
good thing.
items work really well in the short term. As Domille was sort of saying, I think, you know, if a character has a sentient weapon that they carry with them for the length of a campaign, what I've tended to find is they play their part. Maybe it's sort of in highlights, but I will admit I tend to forget that the sword has sentience and exists, and you know there are occasional callbacks to it, or when I think the sword or item has something to offer. But generally speaking, they kind of die down pretty quickly. But I think, and this is exactly what Paul's saying, they're a great quest giver NPC or MacGuffin NPC because they are physically unable to do what they need the party to do, and so it's not like you're given the adventure, the noble pays you to do something, right? Well, he could do it himself, or he could pay someone else to do it. It doesn't feel special. The sentient item physically cannot interact with the world, or it depends on how you've set your item up, but they are 100% reliant on the player agency to get things done. And so as an NPC, I think they're fantastic because they give 100% of the actions to the players. All they can do is advise, comment, jibe, insult, or encourage. They can't do anything for themselves, and so. But I would use them sparingly.
Yeah.
I think like every tool in your toolbox, I think it's important to know when to use it and how often to use it. Anything used too often it just becomes samey. The everyday. You definitely want to give it that element of unusual and interesting and rare.
Here's my suggestion and an alternate way to look at them. A trick I've used that I find super fun. Again, I'm looking at sentient weapons as a DM as an opportunity to play an interesting character, to get in on the role play. Look at the abilities the weapon has and consider: are the abilities simply granted to the wielder, or does the weapon itself have that ability? For example, say you have a sword that grants see invisibility. Does it really grant see invisibility, or can it simply see invisible things, and now the player has to talk to the weapon and say, hey, do you see any invisible stuff around? And then you get to have an interaction with your player.
Oh, yeah.
Or one step further, it can grant invisibility, but it can see invisibility, but at will. It can take it away if it's if it's displeased.
There you go.
I mean, it can leverage its own abilities. And by that way, you can get some great interaction. Well, I can give you this great ability, but only if you do it my way. Are we not doing that anymore? I'm sorry. Suddenly there's a falling out between the player and the weapon, and mid-fight with an invisible stalker, you can no longer see it. Some very quick negotiations at that point might be in order. So there's absolutely some great options there.
Excellent. Well, that is about our time, so I'm going to wrap us up. I'm just going to quickly ask that we go through again, and folks, once again, just give us... I'm just going to go through and call out your names, and just tell us again where folks can find your stuff online. Let's start with Elise.
So everyone, my name is Elise Kertel. You can find my work on DriveThruRPG and the DMs Guild. I'm at DNDElise on Twitter and Facebook, and I'll go ahead and put up some links to my work on my social media so it's easier to find. I do have some upcoming releases coming up to include Through the Veil Tales of the Feywild. It'll be available in print and PDF, hopefully in the next month or two. COVID-19 has slowed down the print review process, and we have two of them. So hopefully it'll be here soon.
Great. Dom?
You can find me, well, I'm a cartographer, and I'm on other things. I write a little bit, do a little bit of this and that, and you can find me on patreon.com/DWW, on Twitter at DemileW, and I'm also on DMs Guild and DriveThruRPG. Basically, you can just find me through Domille's Wondrous works. That's all.
Great. Drew?
Yeah, again, I'm Drew, and you can find me on Twitter at DrewDwarves. I'll put a link in here. I'm also going to put in a link for DMs Guild, everything I've written this year. 2 big projects are going to be half off for everyone in the chat. And, coming soon, coming on the 4th, on Tuesday. I have a new project, part of a project called Supers and Sorcery that is actually going to be a Kickstarter project that I'm writing supervillains for. So very, very fun.
Great.
So you're
Micah?
saying we can check out your NPCs in that?
Yeah. I have an NPC.
We'll see if you've.
I'll see if I'll take
We'll see if we've put all the advice that's in this chat is actually in that book. We'll see if Drew actually walks the walk or he just does a good stream.
One of them is
find me.
Leslie Nope as an Aboleth.
Nice.
Nice. My name's Micah. You can find me at Pyromaniac Press on Twitter and Facebook, and pyromaniacpress.com. All my work's on the DMs Guild or DriveThruRPG. What I would say is I think it's nice for everyone on the chat to see all our faces. I think Dom gets a little bit forgotten in the middle there, and I just want to take a moment to say her maps are fantastic. They are absolutely stellar.
They are amazing.
So you should follow all of us because we're all fantastic, but definitely check out Dom's stuff. All right.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, I'm a patron of your Patreon, so I do enjoy your work.
I really appreciate it.
And I'm Paul Siegel. I am the co-host of Wandering DMs. You can find us on wanderingdms.com or youtube.com/wanderingdms or twitch.tv/wanderingdms. And you can find my publications on my blog at paulsgameblog.com. That does it for us tonight. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the remains of your Gen Con. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Good night.